Here is a question that most fields of psychology have never properly answered. Why do different schools of thought, Freudian psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioural therapy, Jungian depth psychology, Eastern meditation traditions, humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, why do they all seem to work for some people in some situations, but none of them seem to work for everyone in every situation? The standard answer is that some of them are right and some of them are wrong, and the field is still working out which is which. Ken Wilber thinks this answer is deeply inadequate. His answer is something far more interesting, that all of them are partially right, each one capturing a genuine but limited piece of a much larger picture of what consciousness is and how human beings develop. Integral Psychology, published in 2000, is Ken Wilber's attempt to draw that larger picture, to build a single framework, drawing on hundreds of sources, Eastern and Western, ancient and modern, scientific and contemplative, that can honor every legitimate insight into human consciousness without reducing any of them to mere footnotes in somebody else's theory. This is not a self-help book. It is a map, one of the most ambitious maps of the human mind ever attempted, and today we are going to walk through its major territories, carefully, without rushing, but also without getting lost in unnecessary jargon. By the end, you will have a new way of thinking about your own development, your own consciousness, and why the same spiritual experience or therapeutic insight can mean something completely different depending on who's having it. Let us begin.
The word integral is important and worth defining precisely. For Wilber, integral means the genuine integration of all that is given to humanity, not a superficial blending, not an eclectic pick and mix, but a serious attempt to honor every legitimate perspective on consciousness under one coherent roof. The problem he is responding to is this: throughout history, different schools of psychology have repeatedly made the same mistake. They take one genuine, important aspect of consciousness, the unconscious, cognition, behavior, the body, spiritual experience, social conditioning, and announce that this aspect is the only one worth studying, or worse, that it actually exists. The great problem with psychology as it has historically unfolded is that for the most part, different schools of psychology have often taken one of those aspects of the extraordinarily rich and multifaceted phenomenon of consciousness and announced that it is the only one worth studying. Each school, in other words, mistakes its piece of the map for the whole territory, and so we end up with warring factions, each defending a partial truth as if it were the complete truth, dismissing the genuine insights of every other camp. Wilber's proposal is to ask a different question entirely. What if they were all right? What if all of the accounts were an important part of the story? What if all of them possessed true but partial insights into the vast field of consciousness? This is the founding ambition of integral psychology, and to pursue it, Wilber draws on three broad sources of human understanding. From the ancient and pre-modern traditions, the world's great spiritual philosophies, he takes what he calls the great nest of being, a map of the levels of reality from matter to mind to soul to spirit. From modernity, science, psychology, sociology, he takes the careful differentiation of different kinds of knowledge and different domains of reality. And from postmodern thought, philosophy, cultural theory, he takes the insight that context matters enormously, that the same experience means different things in different cultural and developmental settings. Woven together, these three sources give him a framework he calls A-qual, all quadrants, all levels. We will unpack both of those terms as we go. At the heart of Wilber's system is an ancient idea found across virtually every major wisdom tradition in human history, East and West, ancient and medieval, indigenous and philosophical. He calls it the great nest of being. The core idea is that reality is not flat. It is not a single level playing field where everything that exists is basically the same kind of thing. Instead, reality is composed of multiple levels, levels of being and levels of knowing, arranged in a nested hierarchy that runs in its most basic form from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. The core of the perennial philosophy is the view that reality is composed of various levels of existence, levels of being and knowing, ranging from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. To understand what Wilber means by nested, think of a series of concentric circles. The innermost circle is matter, the physical substrate of everything. Surrounding it is body, living biological organization that includes matter but is not reducible to it. Surrounding that is mind, the capacity for thought, symbol and self-reflection, which includes but transcends mere biological life. And so on outward through soul and spirit, each level including everything beneath it, while adding something genuinely new that the lower level could not produce on its own. Wilber calls the units of this structure holons, a term coined by the philosopher Arthur Koestler. A holon is something that is simultaneously a whole in its own right and a part of something larger. An atom is a whole system of subatomic particles and simultaneously a part of a molecule. A molecule is a whole system of atoms and simultaneously a part of a cell. A cell is a whole living system and simultaneously a part of an organism, and so on, all the way up. This matters because it tells us something important about the relationship between levels. Each higher level does not eliminate or contradict the lower, it transcends and includes it. Living bodies transcend mere chemistry, but they still include chemistry. Minds transcend mere biology, but they still include biology. Spirit, in this view, does not negate the material world, it embraces it and permeates it from within. Higher spheres transcend and include the lower. Living bodies transcend but include minerals. Minds transcend but include vital bodies. Luminous souls transcend but include conceptual minds. And radiant spirit transcends and includes absolutely everything. The practical implication of this is significant. It means that a complete psychology cannot restrict itself to any single level. A psychology that studies only behavior is missing the interior. A psychology that studies only the interior is missing the social and cultural context. A psychology that studies only the present moment is missing the developmental dimension, the fact that consciousness actually evolves and grows, both in individuals over a lifetime and in cultures over centuries.
The great nest of being gives Wilber his vertical dimension, the levels through which consciousness moves as it develops. But he argues there is also a crucial horizontal dimension, the fact that every level of reality has at least 4 distinct aspects, or what he calls quadrants. Picture a simple grid. Divide it half vertically, left side is interior, right side is exterior. Divide it half horizontally, top half is individual, bottom half is collective. You now have 4 quadrants, and Wilber argues that every single event, experience, or phenomenon has all 4 simultaneously. The upper left quadrant is the interior of the individual, your subjective inner life, thoughts, feelings, sensations, dreams, meditative states, the stream of consciousness. We speak of this in first-person language. I feel, I think, I experience. This is the home of psychology, phenomenology, and the contemplative traditions. The upper right quadrant is the exterior of the individual, the objective, physical, measurable dimension of a person, brain states, bodily chemistry, neural correlates of consciousness, behavior. We speak of this in third-person language. It functions, it measures, it correlates. This is the home of neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and biology. The lower left quadrant is the interior of the collective, shared culture, shared meaning, shared values and worldviews, the invisible fabric of understanding that a group of people hold in common. We speak in second-person language. We understand, we value, we share. This is the home of cultural anthropology, hermeneutics, and ethics. The lower right quadrant is the exterior of the collective, the objective material structures of society, economic systems, political institutions, technology, the built environment. Also third-person language, but plural, its institutions, its systems, its infrastructure. This is the home of sociology, systems theory, and economics. Wilber summarizes these four quadrants as the beautiful, the good, and the true, the classical triad of ultimate values, the subjective beauty of interior experience, the goodness of our moral and cultural life together, and the objective truth studied by the sciences. Why does this matter for psychology? Because Wilber argues that almost every psychological school in history has committed what he calls the error of privileging one quadrant over the others. Behaviorism focuses almost exclusively on the upper right, observable behavior, measurable outputs, ignoring the interior entirely. Classical psychoanalysis focuses on the upper left, the interior of the individual, but largely ignores the cultural and social context in which that interior develops. Sociological approaches focus on the lower quadrants, but risk reducing the individual to mere product of social forces. A truly integral psychology, Wilber insists, must take all four quadrants seriously simultaneously, because every psychological event, a moment of insight, a traumatic memory, a spiritual experience, has a subjective dimension, a neurological dimension, a cultural dimension, and a social dimension all at once. Reducing any of these to the others is not simplification, it is distortion.
With the great nest as the vertical dimension and the four quadrants as the horizontal dimension, Wilber now introduces what he considers the most practically important aspect of his framework for understanding individual human development: the distinction between stages, streams, and states. These three things are often confused with each other, and getting clear on the difference between them is genuinely illuminating. Stages, or what Wilber also calls waves or levels, are the broad bands of development through which consciousness moves over time, from the most basic, undifferentiated forms of awareness in early childhood, through the conventional structures of the adult mind, into what the contemplative traditions call the higher or transpersonal levels of development. These stages are relatively stable, enduring, and sequential. You cannot skip from the ground floor to the top floor, because each one includes and builds upon the one below. Streams, or developmental lines, are the distinct dimensions along which a person develops, and the crucial insight here is that they develop relatively independently of each other. Wilber identifies more than 24 distinct developmental lines: cognitive development, moral development, emotional intelligence, interpersonal skills, spiritual development, aesthetic sensibility, and many more. This has a remarkable and somewhat humbling implication. A person can be highly developed along one or several lines while remaining quite underdeveloped along others simultaneously. A brilliant scientist can have extraordinary cognitive development and very limited emotional development. A deeply spiritual person can have profound contemplative depth and poorly developed interpersonal skills. A highly effective leader can have strong social intelligence and an underdeveloped moral compass. A person can be very advanced in some lines, medium in others, low in others, all at the same time. This is why simple rankings of human development, this person is more evolved than that person, are almost always too crude to be accurate. Development is not a single ladder with everyone standing at a different rung. It's more like a complex, multi-dimensional terrain where each person has their own unique profile of strengths and underdevelopments across many different lines simultaneously.
States are the third element, and they are fundamentally different from both stages and lines. States are temporary, they come and go. They include the natural states all humans cycle through every day, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and the altered states available through meditation, contemplation, intense emotion, peak experience, and other means. Here, Wilber makes an observation that cuts across a common assumption in both spiritual and psychological circles. Peak experiences, moments of profound insight, mystical union, oceanic feeling, transcendent clarity, are available to people at virtually any stage of development. You do not have to be a highly developed person to have a profound spiritual experience. The experience is a state, and states are accessible regardless of stage. But, and this is the crucial point, the way a person interprets and integrates a peak experience depends very much on their stage of development. The same experience of ego dissolution will be understood, integrated, and acted upon very differently by someone at an early stage of development versus someone who has worked through decades of psychological and contemplative practice. A given peak experience is usually interpreted according to the general stage of development of the individual having the experience. And most importantly, a temporary state, however profound, does not automatically become a permanent realization. The deepest goal of development, what the contemplative traditions point to as genuine transformation rather than mere peak experience, is what Wilber describes as the conversion of states into traits. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The temporary becomes permanent. The peak becomes the baseline.
Running through all of this, through the levels, the streams, the states, is a central navigator. Wilber calls it the self. The self, in his framework, is not a fixed thing. It is not an essence you either have or do not have. It is a process. The ongoing activity of integrating, identifying, and navigating the vast complexity of levels, lines, and states that make up a human life. Wilber identifies three aspects of the self worth distinguishing. The proximate self is what you experience as I, the active, observing subject at the center of your experience, the part of you that makes choices, forms intentions, and undergoes development. The distal self is what you experience as me, the more objective sense of yourself, the self you can describe from the outside, your roles, your history, your characteristics. And the witness, or the ultimate self with a capital S, is the deepest background of awareness itself, the pure consciousness that watches all experience without itself being an object of experience. The most important dynamic in self-development for Wilber is the movement he describes as subject becoming object. At each level of development, the thing you were identified with, the thing you experienced intimately and unreflectively as I, gradually becomes something you can step back from, observe, and no longer be completely captured by. During psychological development, the subject of one stage becomes an object at the next. What you are identified with or embedded in at one stage of development tends to become transcended or disidentified with at the next, so you can see it more objectively, with some distance and detachment. In early development, a child is fully identified with their immediate sensations and impulses. Those impulses are the I. As development proceeds, the child begins to be able to observe those impulses rather than simply being swept along by them. A new I emerges, one capable of looking at sensation and impulse as objects rather than being them unreflectively. This process repeats at every level of development. At each step, something that was an invisible lens through which you saw the world becomes a visible object you can examine, and every time this happens, your perspective widens. You are less captured by any single viewpoint. You become more capable of taking the perspective of others, of seeing your own reactions more clearly, of holding complexity with greater ease. Wilber notes that this process involves a kind of small death at every transition.
When you move from one level to the next, you have to let go of the identity that was organizing your life at the previous level. That letting go can be experienced as genuine loss, a destabilizing, disorienting passage through which the self must travel before it can settle into its new, more expanded form. Each time the self identifies with a particular level of consciousness, it experiences the loss of that level as a death, literally as a type of death seizure, because the very life of the self is identified with that level. At the furthest reaches of this process, in what Wilber draws from the contemplative traditions, even the witness, the ultimate observing self, eventually releases its hold. The subject-object structure of experience itself dissolves. What remains is what mystics across every tradition have attempted to describe and largely agreed cannot be adequately described, a condition in which consciousness and world, self and spirit, are recognized as aspects of the one reality. Ken Wilber built integral psychology over decades, drawing on more than 200 psychological and philosophical traditions. It is not a simple book, but the vision behind it is clear and, I think, genuinely important. The vision is this: human beings are more than their behavior, more than their brains, more than their cultural conditioning, more than their peak experiences. Consciousness is a vast, multidimensional phenomenon, with depth and height, with individual and collective dimensions, with temporary states and enduring structures, with many different developmental lines unfolding at different rates simultaneously. No single school of thought has captured all of this. No single therapy heals every kind of wound. No single spiritual tradition maps every territory. And no single person has developed fully in every dimension. What Wilber offers is not a final answer, but a better map. One large enough to hold the genuine insights of every tradition, and humble enough to acknowledge that any map, however detailed, is still not the territory itself. The practical implication for each of us is something Wilber returns to throughout the book. Try to exercise the full spectrum in the I, we, and it domains. Tend your interior life, your psychology, your contemplative practice, your self-awareness. Tend your relationships and culture, the quality of your moral life, the depth of your connections. And tend your exterior, your body, your behavior, your engagement with the material world. Not because any one of these is the most important, but because you are all of them simultaneously, and the fullest possible life is one lived with awareness of the whole. If this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Which idea from today surprised you most? The quadrants, the distinction between states and stages, or something else? We read every one. Until next time, stay blessed and have a great life.